The field beyond the windmill. There are some villages which appear to have been assembled for the express purpose of being admired from a railway carriage. Cloverfield was one of them. It lay in a long fold of country where the land opened generously beneath a wide sky, and where the roads, white with dust in summer and slick with mud in winter, curved lazily between hedges so old and thick that one felt they had grown less from nature than from habit. In early June, the clover bloomed richly in the low fields, and the wind, passing over it, carried a sweet green scent that lingered in the air even after the sun had gone down. There was a mill on the rise above the village, now long disused, and a square church tower that could be seen for miles. Cottages stood close together along the main lane, each with its own little ceremony of roses, clipped box, or uneven stone path. From a distance, the place might have suggested peace, but Miss Marple had long ago formed the opinion that peace, in villages, was very often no more than a successful appearance. She sat now in the small front parlour of Willowbank Cottage, where she'd come for a fortnight's rest at the insistence of her old friend Mrs. Honoria Bell. Honoria had inherited the cottage from a cousin of impossible habits and uncertain standards, and had spent nearly 2 years imposing order upon it, with the sort of determined cheerfulness that is common among women who have been widowed early and have no intention of being pitied for it. "It is exactly what you needed," Honoria had declared in one of her letters. "Fresh air, quiet, and absolutely no nonsense." Miss Marple had accepted the invitation partly because she was fond of Honoria, and partly because she had noticed over the years that declarations of no nonsense were often followed, in practice, by a great deal of it. Now, in the clear light of late morning, Honoria stood by the window with a pair of gardening gloves in one hand and a basket in the other. "You have no idea," she said, "how fortunate we have been with the weather. Last summer was impossible. Everything mildewed, even people. I said to Dr. Halden at the time that if things continued in that way, half the village would grow mushrooms from the shoulders." Miss Marple smiled. "That would certainly make calls at the vicarage more interesting." Honoria laughed and came to sit opposite her. She was a vigorous woman in her 60s, dang with bright colour, sensible shoes, and a manner which suggested she had never once in her life allowed confusion to become permanent. "I do wish," she said, pouring coffee, "that you had arrived yesterday rather than this morning. There was the most extraordinary business at Nether Clover Farm." "Oh?" said Miss Marple. It was a very small sound, but Honoria, who knew her well, recognised the note at once. "Now don't look like that, Jane. I can see the exact moment your holiday becomes an investigation." "My dear Honoria, I have no investigations, only observations." "Yes, and those are generally much worse for the people concerned. But this really was extraordinary. Young Tom Brierly was ploughing the lower field, the old clover patch beyond the windmill road, and his horse balked. There was some trouble with the ploughshare catching on something below the soil. Tom thought at first it was a root, or an old bit of machinery. He got down to clear it and found..." She paused. Miss Marple looked up. "Yes." "A bone," said Honoria, with satisfaction subdued only by propriety. "Human, apparently. At least that is what everyone says. They sent for the doctor, and then for the police, and by evening there was talk of a whole skeleton." Miss Marple set down her cup. "How very disturbing." Yes, that was exactly Mr. Pritchard's phrase, though he said it in such a way that one knew he found it rather enjoyable. "The field has been cordoned off now, as they say in the newspapers. Half the village went to stare before supper. And the remains are old? So they say. Very old. Years and years. Not some poor tramp from last winter." "If that is what you mean." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "I was not thinking of a tramp." Honoria leaned forward a little. "There's more, naturally." "There generally is. They found the remains in a shallow grave, not terribly deep but deliberate. That is what Dr. Halden told Mrs. Crowe, who told my maid, who repeated it to me while pretending not to gossip. The body had been placed there, Jane, not simply lost." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Outside the window the lane lay bright beneath the sun. A cart passed slowly, and a child in a blue pinafore ran after it with the peculiar seriousness children devote to games that adults never understand. Somewhere nearby, a hen made an indignant noise. Everything was perfectly ordinary. That, Miss Marple reflected, was often the difficulty. "And what does the village think?" she asked. Honoria snorted lightly. "The village thinks 3 separate things at once, as usual. One half insists it must be some ancient matter, perhaps connected with the Civil War. The second half believes it is a gypsy burial, though why gypsies should bury anyone in Brierley's clover patch no one has explained. And the third half, those who are always most dangerous because they are nearest the truth, have begun remembering a girl named Lucy Vale. Miss Marple's eyes lifted. Who was Lucy Vale? Honoria gave a little shrug. A village girl. Pretty, lively, perhaps a little too ambitious for Cloverfield. She disappeared 18 years ago, just after Harvest Fair. There was a great deal of talk at the time, naturally. Some said she had run off to London. Others said she'd gone into service somewhere under another name. Her mother declared to the end of her life that Lucy would have written if she'd gone willingly. And did she? No letter ever came. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Was she engaged? In love? In trouble? Honoria looked almost pleased. That is precisely where opinions become entertaining. Lucy was said to have been walking out with Daniel Mercer, the son of old Amos Mercer, who owned half the western land then and behaved as if he owned the rest by moral right. But there were whispers about someone else too. Someone more suitable. Less suitable, perhaps. Adrian Fisk. Miss Marple considered the name. I do not know it. You wouldn't. He came later, nephew to Mrs. Fisk at the Grange, charming in a polished sort of way, not local, which of course made him automatically interesting. There was some story that Lucy had been seen speaking to him by the mill after dark, but there was never anything proved, and after she vanished the whole thing became one of those village stories that people tell less and less frequently until at last they only remember the outline. And now they remember it again, said Miss Marple softly. Yes. Honoria rose and went back to the window. Her reflection, faint in the glass, seemed for an instant older than the woman herself. It is unpleasant, she said. One doesn't like to think of a girl lying under one's feet all these years, while people pass by with baskets and dogs and parish notices. No, said Miss Marple, one does not. There was a little pause. Then Honoria said briskly, Well, I refuse to let bones spoil luncheon. But I thought you ought to know, because if I didn't tell you and you heard it from someone else, you would say I had omitted the central fact. That is true, said Miss Marple. Honoria turned, smiling. You see, I know you too well. They lunched quietly, and afterwards Miss Marple took her knitting into the garden, where Willowbank Cottage looked over a narrow strip of lawn bordered with lavender and late tulips. Beyond the hedge, one could see fields gently sloping toward the old windmill, and farther still, the pale road to the farm. Cloverfield, she thought, had the look of a place that had managed itself for generations without ever needing to be explained. Such villages possessed long memories, though they were often selective. They remembered scandals with exactitude and kindnesses imperfectly. They forgave theft sooner than social ambition, and immorality sooner than presumption. A village girl who vanished might be pitied for a month, discussed for a year, and then stored away in collective memory under the heading regrettable, but perhaps not entirely surprising. It was not, Miss Marple thought, a very charitable system. She had almost finished the heel of a sock when a shadow fell across the gate. A young man stood there, hat in hand, sunburnt and uneasy. He was broad-shouldered, with fair hair, and the solid build of someone accustomed to work out of doors. "Beg pardon, ma'am," he said. "Mrs. Bell here?" Honoria, hearing the voice, came out at once. "Tom Brierley," she said. "What is it?" He shifted his hat between his hands. "There's a bit more of it, ma'am. At the field. Inspector's there now from Medchester. And Doctor. Holden, they found a clasp. On the dress, maybe. Silver, it looks like. And Mrs. Pritchard says someone ought to tell you, because your late cousin once rented that lower field from the Mercers and might remember whether there had ever been digging done there." Honoria stared. "That was 30 years ago." "Yes, ma'am. And I remember no such thing," Tom nodded, relieved perhaps merely to have completed his errand. As he turned to go, Miss Marple said mildly, "Mr. Brierley, this Lucy Vale, did you know of her?" He stopped. His face altered very slightly, not into surprise, but into that guarded stillness one sees when a familiar ghost has been named. "Everyone knew of her," he said, "though I was only a boy." "And what do they say now?" Tom glanced toward the road where no one stood, though one had the sense that the entire village was listening invisibly from behind hedges. "They say," he said slowly, "that some things were better left in the ground." Then, reddening as if ashamed of his own seriousness, he touched his cap and went away. Miss Marple looked after him. Honoria gave an impatient little click of the tongue. "Nonsense," she said. That is exactly the sort of thing people say when they hope to sound important. Perhaps, said Miss Marple. But she was not thinking of Tom Brierly's tone. She was thinking of the clasp on the dress, of a girl vanished 18 years before, of a grave that had not been hidden deeply enough to resist a plough forever. The wind moved softly across the clover fields beyond the hedge, and Miss Marple very gently laid her knitting aside. The field beyond the windmill did not look like a place that held secrets. It stretched quietly under the wide afternoon sky, its surface broken only by the pale furrows left by Tom Brierly's plough. The clover, where it had not yet been turned, moved in slow waves beneath the wind, giving the land a soft, almost forgiving appearance. Miss Marple, walking beside Mrs. Honoria Bell along the narrow path that bordered the field, reflected that appearances were often the most carefully constructed of all deceptions. "Well," said Honoria, adjusting her hat against the breeze, "I do hope this will not become a regular occupation during your visit. Marching off to scenes of unpleasant discovery is not, I think, what I promised you in my letter." "My dear Honoria," Miss Marple replied gently, "I am merely taking the air." "Yes, but you have chosen to take it in a direction where bones have been found. That is perhaps coincidence." Honoria gave her a look which clearly indicated that she did not believe in such things. The field itself had been partially cordoned off with a length of rope, which fluttered slightly in the wind as though uncertain of its authority. A small group had gathered nearby, some standing, others pretending to walk past with excessive casualness. Villages, Miss Marple knew, had a talent for observing without appearing to do so. Inspector Hale stood near the disturbed earth, speaking quietly with Dr. Halden. He turned as Miss Marple and Mrs. Bell approached. "Mrs. Bell," he said, nodding politely. "Miss Marple," she supplied. "Miss Marple." There was a brief pause during which his eyes rested on her with a kind of cautious curiosity. "You have come to see the discovery? Only if I am not in the way." "You are not," he said, "though there is little to see that has not already been disturbed." Miss Marple stepped carefully closer. The soil had been opened in a rough oval, the darker earth beneath contrasting sharply with the lighter, drier surface. Within it, partially exposed, lay the remains. Even in their present state, there was something unmistakably human in the arrangement. The curve of bone, the quiet suggestion of form. Time had reduced the details, but not the meaning. Nearby, laid upon a folded cloth, was a small collection of items. Miss Marple's eyes moved to them at once. A fragment of fabric, faded, almost colourless now, but once perhaps patterned. A narrow strip of leather, and a clasp. Silver, delicately worked, with a small floral engraving that had survived the years with surprising clarity. "From the dress, we think," said Dr. Halden, following her gaze. "Or perhaps a fastening for a shawl." "It is very pretty," Miss Marple said. Inspector Hale watched her. "Pretty," he repeated. "Yes," said Miss Marple, and therefore remembered. The inspector's expression sharpened slightly. "You believe someone will recognise it?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that someone already has." There was a silence, not an empty one, but the kind that settles when something has been said which cannot easily be dismissed. "You mentioned," said Inspector Hale, "a girl named Lucy Vale." "Yes." "You knew of her?" "No, but I have heard of her." He nodded. "She disappeared 18 years ago. No body was ever found. No evidence of foul play. The matter was allowed to fade. And now?" He looked at the grave. "Now it returns." Miss Marple bent slightly, examining the disturbed earth. "The grave is not deep," she said. "No," said the inspector, "shallow, perhaps hastily done. Or deliberately so." He glanced at her. "How do you mean?" Miss Marple straightened. "In my experience, Inspector, people often bury things only as deeply as they believe necessary. No more." He considered this. "You think the person responsible expected the body to remain undiscovered?" "For a time, certainly." "And after that?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "After that, I imagine they hoped not to be here when it was found." A gust of wind moved across the field, lifting the loose soil slightly and carrying with it the faint earthy scent of something long undisturbed. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the distant windmill. "Was this land always part of Nether Clover Farm?" she asked. Inspector Hale shook his head. "No, it changed hands some years ago. Originally it belonged to the Mercer estate." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Bell, who had been standing slightly behind, now spoke. The Mercers were always a difficult family, she said. Very particular about boundaries, both of land and of people. Inspector Hale made a small note. Boundaries, he repeated. Yes, said Honoria. They did not care for mixing, or for surprises. Miss Marple's eyes rested once more on the clasp. Did Lucy Vale have any connection to the Mercers? She asked. Inspector Hale looked up. There are suggestions, he said carefully. Nothing confirmed. Suggestions are often more revealing than confirmations, Miss Marple replied. At that moment, a figure approached across the field. It was an older man, walking with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who had no intention of hurrying for anyone. His coat was dark, his hat worn but carefully maintained, and his expression set in a manner that suggested long practice in disapproval. Amos Mercer, Mrs. Bell murmured. The man reached the rope and stopped. So, he said, his voice dry, you found it. Inspector Hale turned. You were aware of something to be found, Mr. Mercer? The old man's eyes moved over the disturbed earth, then to the items laid out beside it. I was aware, he said, that the ground has a memory, longer than most people's. Miss Marple watched him. And do you remember Lucy Vale? She asked. And Amos Mercer looked at her. For a moment his expression did not change, then very slightly it did. I remember, he said. And what do you remember? Miss Marple asked gently. He held her gaze. I remember, he said, that she was a foolish girl. There was a pause. And foolishness, he continued, often leads people where they ought not to go. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said, it often does. Amos Mercer looked once more at the grave. Some things, he said, are better left where they are. Then he turned and walked away. The wind moved again across the field. The clover bent, then lifted. Miss Marple stood very still. Inspector, she said quietly, I think we must consider not only who buried Lucy Vale, but why she was buried here. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. Yes, he said, and I believe we must. Miss Marple looked once more at the clasp, at the careful, deliberate way it had been made, at the way it had endured. Because, she added softly, this was not merely concealment. A pause. It was a choice. And somewhere, in the quiet village of Cloverfield, someone knew exactly why that choice had been made. In villages, Miss Marple often thought, the past did not exist as a single truth. It existed in versions. Each person remembered a different Lucy Vale, and somewhere, between those versions, lay the one that mattered. That afternoon, Cloverfield seemed unusually alive. Not outwardly. No more people than usual walked the lane. No louder voices drifted from open windows, but there was a subtle quickening beneath the surface. Doors opened more frequently. Conversations began and ended with unnecessary caution. The discovery in the field had stirred something that had not entirely slept. Miss Marple, returning slowly with Mrs. Bell, allowed the village to reveal itself. My dear Honoria, she said as they passed the small post office, I wonder if you might introduce me to Mrs. Vale. Honoria hesitated. Lucy's mother? Yes. She's still alive, though not strong. Lives in the cottage near the chapel, but I must warn you, Jane, she has never accepted that Lucy ran away. Not for a single day. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is often the case with mothers. Mrs. Vale's cottage was small and carefully kept, its garden bordered with modest flowers that suggested effort rather than abundance. A lace curtain moved slightly at the window as they approached. Honoria knocked. After a moment the door opened. Mrs. Vale was a thin woman. Her face lined not so much with age as with endurance. Her eyes, however, were clear. Clearer, Miss Marple thought, than those of many younger people. Mrs. Bell, she said, I heard you had a visitor. This is Miss Marple, Honoria said gently. She's staying with me. Mrs. Vale inclined her head. You've come about Lucy. It was not a question. Miss Marple stepped forward slightly. Yes, she said, if you will allow me. Mrs. Vale studied her for a moment. Then she opened the door wider. You'd better come in. The room inside was neat, almost sparingly so. A small fire burned in the grate despite the mild weather, and a photograph stood upon the mantel. Miss Marple's eyes moved to it at once. A young girl, smiling. Pretty, not in a striking way, but with a kind of open brightness that made one look twice. That is Lucy, Mrs. Vale said. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. They sat. For a moment no one spoke. Then Mrs. Vale said, "They have found her." It was said without drama, without surprise, only with certainty. "Yes," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Vale nodded. "I always knew she was here." Honoria shifted slightly. "But my dear, there was no evidence." "There was no proof," Mrs. Vale said. "That is not the same thing." Miss Marple looked at her. "No," she said, "it is not." Mrs. Vale folded her hands in her lap. "They said she ran away," she continued, "that she was restless, that she wanted more than Cloverfield could give her." A faint smile touched her lips. "She did want more, but she would not have left without telling me." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did she speak of leaving?" "Yes," said Mrs. Vale, "in the way young girls do. But as something that might happen someday, not as something she had already decided. And in the days before she disappeared?" Mrs. Vale's gaze moved to the photograph. "She was quieter," she said, "thinking, watching." "Watching whom?" Mrs. Vale hesitated. Then she said, "The Mercers." Honoria glanced at Miss Marple. "The Mercers?" Miss Marple repeated gently. "Yes." "Which of them?" Mrs. Vale's expression did not change. "All of them," she said, "but especially the son." "Daniel Mercer?" "Yes." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "And what of him?" she asked. Mrs. Vale's hands tightened slightly. "He was fond of her," she said, "or said he was. And she? She believed him." There was a pause. "But something changed," Mrs. Vale continued, "in the last week. She would not say what. Only that things were not as they seemed." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That is often the beginning of trouble." "Yes," said Mrs. Vale, "it is." "And did she mention anyone else?" Miss Marple asked. There was a longer hesitation this time. "Yes," said Mrs. Vale quietly. "Another name." "Adrian Fisk?" Mrs. Vale looked at her sharply. "You know it." "I have heard it." Mrs. Vale nodded. "He came to the village that summer, stayed at the Grange. Charming, they said. Well-spoken, different." "And Lucy knew him?" "She spoke to him," Mrs. Vale said. "Once or twice. By chance, she said." "And did you believe her?" Mrs. Vale did not answer immediately. "No," she said at last. Miss Marple inclined her head. "On the night she disappeared," Mrs. Vale went on, "she told me she was going to meet someone." Honoria gave a small gasp. "You never said?" "There was no one to tell," Mrs. Vale replied. "Did she say who?" Miss Marple asked. "No. And where?" Mrs. Vale's gaze moved slowly to the window. Beyond it, the field stretched toward the windmill. "She said," Mrs. Vale murmured, "the Cloverfield." A silence followed. Miss Marple sat very still. "That was the last time you saw her?" she asked gently. "Yes." "And you're certain she did not leave the village?" Mrs. Vale looked at her. There was no uncertainty in her eyes. "She never left," she said. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun. The light in the room dimmed slightly, as though the day itself had paused to listen. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you," she said. Mrs. Vale nodded. As they moved toward the door, she spoke again. "They will say things," she said, "now that she has been found. They will remember differently." Miss Marple turned. "Yes," she said, "they will." "But you will not," Mrs. Vale said. Miss Marple met her gaze. "No," she said softly, "I will not." Outside, the wind had picked up again. The clover fields moved beneath it, restless and green. Honoria walked beside her in silence for some distance. Then she said, "Jane, this is all becoming rather serious." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It was one thing when it was just bones in a field, but now it is a person," Miss Marple said gently, "and a story." Honoria shivered. "I do not like it," she said. "No," said Miss Marple, "nor should you." They walked on, and behind them, in the small cottage near the chapel, a photograph stood upon a mantel. A girl smiling, and in the field beyond the windmill, the earth had begun to give up its truth. The Grange stood at the far end of Cloverfield, set back behind iron gates that had long ago ceased to keep anyone out, but still served the purpose of reminding everyone where they stood. It was a large house, larger than any other in the village, and built in a style that suggested both ambition and permanence. Ivy crept along its stone walls, not untidily but with a certain quiet determination, and the gravel drive curved in a manner that required visitors to approach slowly, as though giving the house time to consider them. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bell arrived just before 4. "I do not know what you expect to find here," Honoria said, lowering her voice as they walked up the drive, "but Mrs. Fisk is not a woman who enjoys being questioned." "I have no intention of questioning her," Miss Marple replied, "only of listening." "Yes, well, that is generally worse." They were received by a maid who looked at them with polite uncertainty, and after a brief delay, shown into a drawing room of considerable size and careful arrangement. It was a room designed to impress without appearing to do so. High ceilings, tall windows, and furniture that had been chosen not for comfort but for its ability to suggest it. Mrs. Fisk entered a few moments later. She was a tall woman, still handsome in a severe way, with dark hair streaked lightly with grey, and a manner that combined courtesy with unmistakable authority. Her eyes moved over Miss Marple with a quick assessing glance before settling into something more neutral. "Mrs. Bell," she said, "and Miss Marple." "Yes." There was the faintest pause. "Ah, you have come about the unfortunate discovery in the lower field." It was not a question. Miss Marple inclined her head. "It has caused a great deal of concern." "As such things do," said Mrs. Fisk. She took a seat opposite them, her posture perfectly controlled. "For many years," Miss Marple said gently, "there has been uncertainty about the disappearance of Lucy Vale." Mrs. Fisk's expression did not change. "Yes. And now that she has been found—" "She has not been identified," Mrs. Fisk interrupted calmly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, not officially." There was a brief silence. "You will forgive me," Mrs. Fisk said, "but I fail to see how I can assist you." Miss Marple folded her hands. "I understand that your nephew, Mr. Adrian Fisk, was in Cloverfield at the time of Lucy Vale's disappearance." This time, the pause was longer. "Yes," said Mrs. Fisk at last. "He was staying here? For a short period. And did he know Lucy Vale?" Mrs. Fisk's gaze rested steadily on Miss Marple. "My nephew was acquainted with many people during his visit." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "He was, I imagine, a charming young man." "Yes. Such men often are." Mrs. Fisk did not reply. "Do you recall," Miss Marple continued, "whether he had any particular acquaintance with Lucy Vale?" Mrs. Fisk's hands resting lightly on her lap did not move. "I recall," she said, "that Lucy Vale was a girl who attracted attention. Indeed. And that she may have misunderstood certain attentions." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That is a possibility." "More than a possibility," said Mrs. Fisk. There was a faint emphasis in her voice now. "My nephew was not in the habit of forming attachments in villages," she continued. "He had his future to consider." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "And he left Cloverfield shortly after?" "Yes. Very shortly," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Fisk's gaze sharpened slightly. "You have been making inquiries." "I have been listening." Mrs. Fisk rose. It was not a sudden movement, but it carried with it a clear intention. "I must ask you," she said, "to be careful, Miss Marple." Miss Marple looked up at her. "In what way?" "In the way you interpret things," Mrs. Fisk replied. "Villages have a tendency to embroider the past. It is rarely accurate." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "but embroidery, when examined closely, often reveals the original pattern." For a moment the two women looked at one another. Then Mrs. Fisk said, "My nephew is no longer here. He has not been here for many years. Whatever may have occurred in Cloverfield at that time has nothing to do with him now." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That is a point of view." "It is a fact," said Mrs. Fisk. Miss Marple rose. "Thank you for your time." Mrs. Fisk did not attempt to detain them. As they left the house and walked back down the drive, Honoria let out a breath she had clearly been holding. "Well," she said, "that was not particularly enlightening." "No," said Miss Marple. "No, she told us nothing." Miss Marple's smile was very slight. "My dear Honoria, she told us a great deal." Honoria frowned. "She denied everything." "Not quite," said Miss Marple. "She denied only what she believed could be proved." They reached the gate. "And what does that mean?" Honoria asked. Miss Marple paused, looking back at the house. The windows reflected the fading light, giving nothing away. "It means," she said quietly, "that Adrian Fisk knew Lucy Vale better than his aunt would care to admit." Honoria's eyes widened. "You think—" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Lucy Vale went to the Cloverfield to meet someone she trusted. And that someone was not Daniel Mercer," Miss Marple finished softly. They walked on in silence. The wind had risen again, carrying with it the scent of clover and earth. "And if it was Adrian Fisk," Honoria said at last, "what became of him?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. "That," she said, "is the next question." They reached the lane. Behind them the Grange stood quiet and composed, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But Miss Marple, as she turned away, felt a quiet certainty settle into her mind. The past had not vanished, it had merely been managed. And somewhere within that careful management, a truth remained, waiting. If Cloverfield remembered Lucy Vale in fragments, it remembered Daniel Mercer in something closer to certainty. He had never left. That, Miss Marple reflected as she walked with Mrs. Bell toward the Mercer house the following morning, was in itself a kind of statement. The Mercer property lay on the western edge of the village, where the land rose slightly and the hedges grew thicker, as though determined to maintain a distance. The house itself was solid, built in a square, practical style that suggested utility over comfort. It had been added to over the years in small, unsympathetic ways, on each extension marking a different period of ownership rather than a unified design. It was grander once, Honoria said, in Amos Mercer's time, though even then it was more respected than liked. And now, Miss Marple asked? Now it is simply endured. Daniel Mercer met them at the door. He was not what Miss Marple had expected. Not young, though not old either, but carrying about him a weight that did not belong to years alone. His face was strong, weathered by sun and wind, his hair already touched with grey. There was something steady in his manner, something grounded, and something held back. "Mrs. Bell," he said, nodding. "Miss Marple?" "Yes." His eyes rested on her for a moment longer than politeness required. "You've come about the field." It was said without curiosity, only acknowledgement. "If you have a moment," Miss Marple said. He stepped aside. "Come in." The room inside was plain, almost stark. There were no unnecessary ornaments, no softening touches. Everything had its place, and nothing existed without purpose. Daniel Mercer remained standing. "What is it you want to know?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at him, at the stillness in his posture, at the quiet control in his voice. "You knew Lucy Vale," she said. There was no denial. "Yes." The word was simple, without hesitation. "And you were fond of her?" A pause. "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And she of you?" Daniel Mercer's gaze shifted slightly, not away, but inward. "So I believed," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Belief," she said gently, "can be a dangerous thing." He did not reply. "On the night she disappeared," Miss Marple continued, "she went to the Cloverfield." "Yes." "You knew that?" "Yes." Honoria shifted beside her. "And you did not go to meet her?" Miss Marple asked. Daniel Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. "No." "Why not?" He hesitated. "Because she had told me not to." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Indeed?" "She said she needed to speak to someone else first," he said, "that there were things she needed to understand." "And you agreed?" "I did not like it," he said, "but I agreed." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "And this someone else? You knew who it was?" "Yes." "Adrian Fisk?" "Yes." The name settled between them. "And what did you think of him?" Miss Marple asked. Daniel Mercer gave a short, humourless sound. "I thought he was a man who enjoyed being admired. And Lucy admired him?" "She was curious," he said, "and he encouraged it." Miss Marple nodded. "And on that night, you did not follow her?" "No." "Did you see her afterward?" "No." "Did you go to the field?" "Yes." Honoria gave a small exclamation. "When?" Miss Marple asked. "Later," he said, "when she did not return." "And what did you find?" Daniel Mercer's hands tightened at his sides. "Nothing." Miss Marple watched him. "Nothing at all?" A pause. Then, "No." Miss Marple did not press him. Not yet. "And Adrian Fisk?" she asked instead. "He had gone," said Daniel Mercer. "Left the village the next morning." "Without explanation?" "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That must have seemed significant." "It did," he said. "And yet nothing was done." "No?" "Why?" Daniel Mercer looked at her. There was something in his expression now, something harder. Because, he said, there was no proof. Miss Marple inclined her head. And proof, she said softly, is often what people hide behind. There was a silence. Then she said, Mr. Mercer, when you went to the field that night, did you speak to anyone? He hesitated. Yes. To whom? A man who had no business being there. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Who? Daniel Mercer looked toward the window. My father. Honoria stared. Amos Mercer? Yes. And what was he doing there? Miss Marple asked quietly. Daniel Mercer's voice was steady. Digging. The word fell into the room like a stone. Honoria gasped. Digging, she repeated. Yes. Miss Marple did not move. And you said nothing of this? She asked. No. Why not? Daniel Mercer's eyes met hers. Because he told me, he said, that if I spoke, I would destroy everything. Miss Marple held his gaze. And you believed him? A long pause. Yes. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Belief, she said again, is a powerful thing. There was no anger in her voice, only understanding. And now? She asked. Daniel Mercer looked toward the fields beyond the window. Now it has come back, he said. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. It always does. They rose to leave. At the door, Miss Marple paused. Mr. Mercer, she said, did your father ever speak of Lucy Vale again? No. And did you? Daniel Mercer shook his head. No. Miss Marple inclined her head. That, she said, is often how such things continue. He did not reply. Outside, the wind moved steadily across the land. Honoria walked beside her in silence for some time. Jane, she said at last, this is dreadful. Yes. Do you really think that Amos Mercer? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. I think, she said at last, that he knew more than he ever intended to reveal. And Daniel? Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. I think he has been carrying it ever since. They walked on. Behind them, the Mercer house stood still and silent, and beyond it, the field waited. By late afternoon, the sky over Cloverfield had taken on that pale, uncertain colour which often precedes rain. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a dampness that seemed to settle not only on the land, but on the mind. Miss Marple sat in the small garden at Willowbank Cottage, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She was thinking, not of what had been said, but of what had not. Daniel Mercer had told the truth. Of that she felt certain, but not the whole of it. Jane, said Mrs. Bell, coming out with a shawl over her shoulders, you have not made a single stitch in the last 10 minutes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I am considering. Yes, well, do try to consider while knitting. It looks more restful. Miss Marple resumed her work. Honoria, she said gently, when Daniel Mercer spoke of finding his father in the field, digging, did anything strike you as curious? Honoria frowned. Curious. The entire thing is curious. Yes, but beyond that. Honoria considered. Well, he said he found nothing. Yes. And yet his father was digging. Yes. They looked at one another. You mean, said Honoria slowly, that he must have seen something? Miss Marple inclined her head. And chose not to say so, Honoria added. Yes. There was a silence. Why? Honoria asked. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Because what he saw did not fit the explanation he was given. Honoria blinked. I do not follow. Miss Marple set down her knitting. Let us suppose, she said, that Daniel Mercer went to the field expecting to find Lucy, alive, or at least to find some sign of her. Yes. And instead he found his father digging. Yes. But not alone. Honoria stared. Not alone? Miss Marple looked at her. He said he spoke to a man who had no business being there, she said. Then he said it was his father. Yes. But the way he said it suggested something else. Honoria's eyes widened. You think there was someone else there? Yes. And he did not tell us? No. Why not? Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. Because that person is still here. The words settled between them. Honoria drew in a breath. Jane, do you mean someone in Cloverfield now? Yes. Someone who was there that night? Yes. Honoria sat down slowly. This is quite terrible." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and Amos Mercer." Miss Marple's gaze moved toward the distant fields. "I think Amos Mercer did what he believed necessary," she said, "but not for the reasons we might assume." Honoria frowned. "You mean he did not kill her?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. "I think," she said, "that Lucy Vale was already dead when he began to dig." There was a long silence. "And the person who killed her?" Honoria asked quietly. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily now. "That," she said, "is what we must determine." The rain began just after 6, soft at first, then more steadily, until the fields beyond the hedge were blurred into a shifting grey. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching. Rain, she thought, had a way of revealing things. It softened the ground, loosened what had been fixed, brought to the surface what had been hidden. Later that evening there was a knock at the door. Inspector Hale stood on the threshold, his coat damp, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Marple," he said, "Mrs. Bell." "Inspector," said Honoria, "do come in. You look as though you have been standing in the truth for some time." He removed his hat and stepped inside. "I have been standing in the field," he said, "which may amount to the same thing." They sat. Tea was brought. "There have been developments," the inspector said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "The remains have been examined more closely," he continued. "There are signs of injury." "What kind?" Miss Marple asked. "A blow to the head," he said. "Forceful, likely fatal." Honoria gasped softly. "So she was killed," she said. "Yes." "And not accidentally," Miss Marple added. "No." The inspector paused. "There is more," he said. Miss Marple waited. "We found something else in the soil," he continued, "near the body." He reached into his pocket and produced a small object wrapped in cloth. Carefully he unfolded it. It was a ring. Simple. Gold. Worn, but not damaged. Miss Marple leaned forward. "A man's ring," she said. "Yes." "Engraved?" The inspector turned it slightly. "There are initials," he said. "DM." Honoria looked from one to the other. Daniel Mercer," she said. The room fell silent. Miss Marple did not move. "Where exactly was it found?" she asked. "Near the hand," said the inspector, "as though it had been dropped." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "Yes," the inspector repeated. "You do not seem surprised." Miss Marple looked at him. "No," she said. "And yet you do not believe it belongs to him." "No," she said again. Inspector Hale studied her. "Why not?" Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "Because," she said, "it has been placed there." A silence followed. "Placed?" said Honoria. "Yes." "But why?" Miss Marple turned to the inspector. "Because someone wishes us to believe that Daniel Mercer killed Lucy Vale." Inspector Hale's expression sharpened. "And you think he did not?" Miss Marple met his gaze. "I think," she said, "that he has been protecting someone else." The rain fell steadily against the windows. "And now," Miss Marple added softly, "that someone has begun to protect themselves." Inspector Hale leaned back slightly. "You believe," he said, "that the truth is being arranged?" "Yes." "In what way?" Miss Marple picked up the ring. "In the way most convenient to the person who fears it." She turned it gently in her fingers. The initials caught the light. DM. A simple mark. A simple explanation. Too simple. Miss Marple set the ring down. "This," she said quietly, "is not the truth." A pause. "It is a suggestion." Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in Cloverfield, someone had begun to move. Rain has a way of loosening more than soil. By the following morning, Cloverfield had begun to change. Not outwardly, people still walked to the bakery, still paused at the gate to exchange pleasantries, still spoke of the weather with dutiful consistency. But beneath it all, something had shifted. The discovery of the ring, with its quiet, dangerous initials, had done what the bones alone could not. It had given the past a direction. And direction, Miss Marple knew, often led people to speak when silence would have served them better. Miss Marple sat at the small breakfast table at Willowbank Cottage, turning the events of the previous evening carefully over in her mind. The ring. Placed. Not lost. Not dropped. Placed. That, she thought, was the key to everything. "Jane," said Mrs. Bell, entering with a pot of tea, "the entire village is discussing Daniel Mercer. I have never known such agreement. It is quite unnatural, Miss Marple smiled faintly. Agreement is often unnatural, my dear. Yes, well, in this case it is also rather alarming. They are quite certain now. The ring has settled everything. Miss Marple looked up. Has it? Well, naturally. Initials, you see. People are very fond of initials. They save so much thinking. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And yet, she said gently, they do not always save one from being mistaken. Mrs. Bell frowned. You still do not believe he is responsible? No. Even after the ring? Especially after the ring. There was a pause. Then why would someone place it there? Honoria asked. Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. Because, she said, they needed the story to be simple. Simple? Yes. A girl disappears. A young man in love with her is jealous, perhaps angry. There is an argument, a blow, a burial. Years pass. The truth is uncovered. Honoria nodded slowly. Yes, she said. That is exactly what everyone is saying. Miss Marple smiled. Yes, she said. That is why it is so useful. Later that morning, Miss Marple walked alone. She had no particular destination in mind, or rather she had one, but she preferred not to name it yet, even to herself. The village moved around her, familiar now, its rhythms beginning to settle into patterns she could recognize. She passed the post office, the bakery, the narrow lane that led toward the chapel, and then she stopped. Two women stood by a gate speaking in low voices. They fell silent as she approached, naturally. Good morning, Miss Marple said pleasantly. Morning, one of them replied. Miss Marple paused as though uncertain whether to continue. I wonder, she said, if you might help me. I am trying to understand something about Lucy Vale. There was a brief hesitation. Well, said the second woman, there's not much to understand. She was that sort of girl. That sort, Miss Marple repeated gently. The woman shifted slightly. Always wanting more than she had, she said, looking beyond her place. Yes, said Miss Marple. And did she find it? The woman did not answer. The first one said, she got herself into trouble. Miss Marple inclined her head. With whom? There was a pause. Mr. Mercer, the woman said at last. Daniel Mercer. Yes. And no one else? The two women exchanged a glance. Well, there were stories, the first one said. About Mr. Fisk? Miss Marple asked. The second woman stiffened. We don't speak of him, she said quickly. Oh, do you not? No. Miss Marple smiled gently. And yet you remember him. The woman flushed slightly. He wasn't one of us, she said. That's all. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she said. That is often enough. She walked on. There it was again. The name. Not spoken willingly, but not forgotten. Adrian Fisk. A man who had come, who had been noticed, and who had left. Too quickly. Miss Marple's steps slowed. There was something wrong. Not in what had been said, but in the way it had been remembered. Lucy Vale, Daniel Mercer, Adrian Fisk. The story did not sit correctly. It was too arranged. She turned and began to walk toward the Grange. Mrs. Fisk received her again. This time there was no delay. You have returned, she said. Yes. You have not yet finished your inquiries. No. Mrs. Fisk regarded her steadily. And now? She asked. Miss Marple stepped forward. Now, she said gently, I believe we must speak plainly. A silence fell between them. Very well, said Mrs. Fisk. Miss Marple's voice was calm. Your nephew did not leave Cloverfield of his own choosing. Mrs. Fisk's expression did not change. No? No. And what leads you to that conclusion? Miss Marple met her gaze. Because, she said, he never truly left. The words hung in the air. For the first time, Mrs. Fisk's composure shifted, only slightly, but enough. That is absurd, she said. Is it? Yes. Miss Marple did not argue. Instead, she said quietly, Where is Adrian Fisk now? Mrs. Fisk did not answer. A long silence followed. Then she said, He died. Miss Marple inclined her head. When? Years ago. And where? Mrs. Fisk's gaze moved, just for a moment, toward the window, toward the fields beyond. I do not see how that concerns you, she said. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. I think, she said, that it concerns us all. Outside, the wind moved steadily across the land, and in the distance, the Cloverfield lay quiet, but Miss Marple knew it would not remain so, because now another name had begun to surface, and with it, another truth. It is a curious thing, Miss Marple often thought, how truth resists a direct path. One may approach it from every reasonable angle and find nothing, and then, quite suddenly, one sees it, not as a fact discovered, but as something remembered. By the time Miss Marple left the Grange that afternoon, she knew not everything but enough. Enough to understand that the story Cloverfield had been telling itself for 18 years was not merely incomplete, it was wrong. The evening drew in quietly, the wind had settled, and the sky, though still heavy with cloud, held a kind of waiting stillness. Miss Marple sat by the window at Willowbank Cottage, her hands folded, her knitting untouched once more. Mrs. Bell watched her with increasing unease. "Jane," she said at last, "you have that look again." "What look?" "The one that suggests you know something and are deciding whether to tell me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Honoria, I am deciding how best to explain it." "Well," said Honoria, "do begin, because I cannot make sense of any of it. If Daniel Mercer did not kill Lucy, and if Adrian Fisk did not leave, then what did happen?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Then she said very gently, "Lucy Vale went to the Cloverfield that night to meet Adrian Fisk." "Yes," said Honoria, "that much we know." "She believed," Miss Marple continued, "that he would offer her something more than Cloverfield, a future, a way out." Honoria nodded. "And he encouraged that belief," Miss Marple said. "Yes. But he had no intention of fulfilling it." There was a pause. "You mean," said Honoria slowly, "he was merely amusing himself?" Miss Marple's expression was very quiet. "Yes." Honoria's face hardened slightly. "That is a cruel thing." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It is." She rose and moved to the window. "But Lucy Vale," she continued, "was not foolish. Not in the way people have chosen to remember her. She saw something, understood something." Honoria leaned forward. "What?" Miss Marple turned. That Adrian Fisk had already arranged to leave the village, and had no intention of taking her with him." Honoria's eyes widened. "And she confronted him?" "Yes." There was a silence. "And what happened then?" Honoria asked quietly. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, "Let us consider what we know." She began to speak slowly, carefully, as though placing each piece exactly where it belonged. "Lucy Vale went to the field. Adrian Fisk was there. They argued. That much is certain. Yes. At some point during that argument, she fell." Honoria frowned. "Fell?" Miss Marple nodded. "There was a blow to the head," she said, "but not necessarily a deliberate one. It could have been the result of a struggle, a push, a moment of anger." Honoria drew in a breath. You mean it was an accident?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady. "I think," she said, "that it began as one." "And then?" Honoria asked. Miss Marple's voice was very soft now. Then someone else arrived. The room seemed to grow still. "Amos Mercer," Honoria whispered. "Yes." He saw what had happened," Miss Marple said. "And what did he do?" Miss Marple looked toward the darkening fields. "He made a decision." At that moment there was a knock at the door. Inspector Hale entered. "Miss Marple," he said. "Mrs. Bell." "Inspector," said Honoria, "you arrive at a most inconvenient moment. We are just reaching the interesting part." "I imagine," he said, "that we are about to reach the same conclusion." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps," she said. Inspector Hale removed his coat and stepped inside. "I have been reviewing the evidence," he said, "and speaking with certain people." "And?" Miss Marple asked. "And I believe," he said, "that Adrian Fisk did not leave Cloverfield alive." A silence followed. Honoria looked from one to the other. "Then, where is he?" she asked. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly toward the window, toward the fields, toward the clover patch beyond the windmill. "He is there," she said. Inspector Hale nodded. "Yes," he said. "We have begun to search." Honoria stared. "You mean there are 2 graves?" Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. "Yes." The realization settled slowly. Lucy Vale had not been buried alone. And Amos Mercer, Honoria said. He buried them both. Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector Hale spoke. He buried one, he said. And the other? Honoria asked. Miss Marple turned back to them. The other, she said softly, was buried later. A long silence followed. By whom? The inspector asked. Miss Marple met his gaze. By the person, she said, who had the most to lose. Outside, the night had fallen. The fields lay dark and still. But beneath the surface, the past was no longer at rest. And before the morning, it would be uncovered completely. By dawn, the field beyond the windmill no longer belonged to Cloverfield. It belonged to the past. The sky was pale and uncertain, the kind of early light that makes everything appear both clearer and more distant. A thin mist lay over the clover, softening the edges of the land, as though the earth itself wished to delay what was about to be revealed. Miss Marple stood beside Inspector Hale at the edge of the cordoned area. Mrs. Bell had insisted on coming too, though she now stood a little apart, clutching her shawl as if it might protect her from what lay beneath the soil. You need not stay, Miss Marple had told her gently. I most certainly do, Honoria had replied. If one is to be shocked, one should at least be properly informed. The men had been digging since first light, carefully, deliberately. The ground, softened by the previous day's rain, yielded more easily now, and as the soil was turned back, the shape beneath began to emerge. A second disturbance, a second grave. Inspector Hale said nothing. He did not need to. Miss Marple watched quietly. There was no triumph in her expression, only a kind of quiet recognition. After some time, one of the men straightened. Sir, he said. The inspector stepped forward. Miss Marple followed. The remains were less intact than the first, and time had not been as gentle, but there was enough to understand. A fragment of bone, a piece of fabric, and a cufflink. Inspector Hale bent to examine it. Initials, he said. Miss Marple did not need to ask. The letters lay small and certain against the worn metal. Adrian Fisk. Behind them, Mrs. Bell gave a faint, unsteady sound. Then it is true, she said. He never left. No, said Miss Marple softly. He did not. For a long moment no one spoke. The mist began to lift. The field, revealed again, seemed somehow altered, not in appearance, but in meaning. Inspector Hale straightened. 2 bodies, he said. 2 graves. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. And 2 moments, she added quietly. He looked at her. What do you mean? Miss Marple turned slightly, her gaze moving across the field. Lucy Vale was buried first, she said. By Amos Mercer. Yes. And Adrian Fisk? Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. Later. Inspector Hale was silent for a moment. Then Amos Mercer did not kill him. No. And Daniel Mercer. Miss Marple shook her head. No. The inspector's expression sharpened. Then who? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she said, We must go back to that night. The wind moved lightly across the field now, carrying away the last of the mist. Lucy Vale went to meet Adrian Fisk, Miss Marple continued. They argued. She realised that he had no intention of keeping his promises, that he was leaving, and leaving her behind. Inspector Hale nodded. In the course of that argument, she fell. Yes. And Amos Mercer arrived. Yes. He saw what had happened. Yes. And he made a decision. Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the distant Mercer house. He saw a scandal, she said. A girl dead in his field. A man, an outsider, responsible. And his son involved, the inspector added. Yes. So he buried her. Yes. To protect what? Miss Marple's voice was very quiet. Everything. There was a pause. And Adrian Fisk? The inspector asked. Miss Marple turned to him. Adrian Fisk remained, she said, for a time. The inspector frowned. Why would he stay? Miss Marple's expression was calm. Because he believed he was safe. A silence followed. He thought the matter had been resolved, she continued, that Lucy Vale had disappeared, so that no one would question it. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. And then? Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the field. To someone else, she said. Who? The inspector asked. Miss Marple looked at him. The one person, she said, who could not accept what had happened. There was a long pause. Then, Mrs. Vale, said the inspector quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, Honoria gasped. But she said... Miss Marple turned to her gently. She said Lucy had gone to meet someone, she said, and she knew where. Inspector Hale's voice was thoughtful now. She went to the field. Yes. And she found... Miss Marple's eyes were very soft. She found Adrian Fisk. A silence fell. And she knew, Miss Marple continued, what had happened. Inspector Hale nodded slowly. She confronted him. Yes. And then? Miss Marple's voice did not change. She killed him. The words settled into the morning air. No one spoke. For her daughter, Miss Marple said quietly. For the truth that had been buried. For the life that had been taken and dismissed. Inspector Hale exhaled slowly. And then she buried him. Yes. A long silence followed. Why did she never speak? Honoria asked faintly. Miss Marple looked at her. Because, she said, she believed the matter was finished. And now? Miss Marple turned back to the field. Now, she said, it has returned. The wind moved gently through the clover. The earth once silent had spoken, and the truth, long buried, had finally been uncovered. But one final thing remained, and before the day was done, it too would be spoken. By the time the second grave had been fully uncovered, Cloverfield had already begun to decide what it would remember. Not the details, not the truth in its entirety, but something simpler, something easier to live with. Miss Marple walked slowly back from the field with Inspector Hale, the morning now fully awake around them. The mist had lifted completely, leaving the land clear and exposed, as though nothing had ever been hidden beneath it. And yet, everything had been. You were right, said Inspector Hale at last. Miss Marple glanced at him. About Mrs. Vale? Yes, he paused. She has admitted it. Miss Marple nodded. I thought she would. She said very little, he continued. Only that she found him there, that he tried to leave, that she would not allow it. Miss Marple's eyes were distant now. Yes, she said softly. That is enough. Inspector Hale looked at her. You do not seem surprised. No. And you do not condemn her? Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Inspector, she said gently, there are crimes which belong to the law, and there are those which belong to something else entirely. He frowned slightly. You believe this is one of the latter? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe, she said, that it began as something very human. They walked on in silence for a while. The village had begun its day. Doors opened, voices carried, life resumed, and yet something had changed. Will you charge her? Miss Marple asked quietly. Inspector Hale hesitated. That is not entirely my decision, he said. There are considerations. Yes, said Miss Marple, there always are. They reached the lane that led back to Willowbank Cottage. Inspector Hale stopped. There is one thing, he said. The ring. Miss Marple looked at him. Yes. We found no evidence that Mrs. Vale placed it, he said. And Daniel Mercer insists it was taken from him, years ago. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Yes, she said. Then who? She met his gaze. The person, she said gently, who needed the truth to point elsewhere. Inspector Hale was silent. Then he said, Mrs. Fisk. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes. She knew, the inspector said slowly, or suspected. Yes. And she wished to protect her nephew's reputation. Even after his death, Miss Marple said softly. Inspector Hale exhaled. So, she placed the ring. Yes. To make it appear that Daniel Mercer was responsible. Yes, there was a long pause. Then there are 3 crimes, he said. One by Adrian Fisk. One by Mrs. Vale. And one by Mrs. Fisk. Miss Marple shook her head slightly. No, she said. Only 1 crime and 2 attempts to live with it. Inspector Hale looked at her thoughtfully. You see it differently. Yes. They parted there. Miss Marple returned to Willowbank Cottage, where Mrs. Bell was waiting with an expression that hovered between anxiety and curiosity. Well, she demanded. Miss Marple removed her gloves and sat down. "It is finished," she said. Honoria stared. "Finished? How can it be finished? There are still so many things." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Honoria, there are always things. But the truth itself is quite simple." She spoke then, quietly, carefully. And when she had finished, Mrs. Bell sat very still. "I do not know what to think," she said at last. Miss Marple reached for her knitting. "No," she said, "that is often the case." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked once more to the field. It was quiet again. The ropes had been removed, the earth smoothed. The disturbance, though recent, had already begun to fade. The clover moved gently in the wind, as though nothing had ever happened. Miss Marple stood for a moment. She thought of Lucy Vale, of a girl who had wanted more, who had trusted the wrong person, who had been remembered incorrectly for far too long. She thought of Adrian Fisk, of charm without responsibility, of consequences never faced until they were, and of Mrs. Vale, a mother who had waited and then acted. "People say," Miss Marple murmured softly, "that the past is buried." She looked down at the ground. "But it is not." A small pause. "It is only covered." The wind moved through the clover, and for a moment, just a moment, it seemed as though the field itself remembered. Miss Marple turned and began to walk back toward the village. Cloverfield looked as it always had, peaceful, ordered, entirely respectable. But Miss Marple knew, as she always had, that beneath such surfaces lay something else, something enduring, something human. And as she reached the lane, she smiled, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. "The truth," she said quietly, "does not disappear." A pause. "It waits." And with that, she walked on. The hidden grave in Cloverfield is not merely a story of murder, but of memory, silence, and the quiet burdens people carry through time. In uncovering Lucy Vale's fate, Miss Marple reveals more than a crime. She reveals the fragile line between justice and compassion and the dangerous comfort of forgetting. That in Cloverfield, the dead were buried, but not the truth. And in the end, it was not evidence alone that solved the mystery, but the simple, enduring understanding of human nature.